for some of the trainers, particularly when they come to other countries, like coming to Germany as well too, is that the keyboards might be very different. So I think that the biggest challenge was working on a Russian keyboard and an Arabic keyboard. Also on a German keyboard, the keys are a little bit different. So if you have a password that you remember because of where the keys are on your keyboard, they may not work when you go to other countries. In terms of, you saw some technology in terms of what are specific examples or specific things that we may have done. So there was a specific organization that had come under a threat because they had had their computers stolen 3 times in a year. They were working on documenting people who had been killed 30 years earlier by some military officials. So these were people that were going into the field, that were recording testimonies of people who had witnessed things. They were bringing all that information to the office using their computers and putting on their computers. They would come into the office the next morning. Either the computers would be gone, sometimes the filing cabinets were gone, and then most recently is just the hard drives would be gone. And so they had no ways, they were just working on individual workstations. So this is an organization that had about 60 people working, and they had a problem. They needed their information backed up. And so what do you do if you have an organization with about 40 computers, because they're shared sometimes, and they want to do a backup solution? And so this came to the attention of both us as well as the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it was thanks to the US organization who was working with this partner said, we really need to do something. And they said, well, if they're backing up everything on their computers, why don't we put them on a network, get a file server, and do a tunnel to do a backup using SSH, using rsync to back up all the information on a remote site. Sounds good. What do you need to do first? You need to build a network, right? You need to get network cards. You need to wire, and you need to find people who can support them. And so this took about 2 months to plan, to find the budget, what everything would cost. And that's one of the challenges that you get. So what did that look like? So here's the organization. We asked for volunteers in the organizations. We talk with the directors of the organization to say, who are employees that are going to stay with the organization for a long time, who people tend to go to for help, either with technology or other things. And they identified 3 individuals who have been around with the organization, who tend to do things all the time. And so we had our volunteers, and then we had to train them on how to build a network. So the first thing you have to do is not bring the cables, but we had to find where you could find PVC and internet cables and crimping tools and source them locally at a cost that was far more expensive, but at least if we needed extra cable, we could find it locally. And then it was working with the people of the organization to actually, do the hard work. This is before wireless was really being used, and probably still would recommend this, is build an Ethernet network with switches. So we had to help them with how to wire it, how the schematic, how the network would look like, what type of cable to use, because we went to the hardware place, and they of course wanted to sell us the cheapest cable, and we're like, no, we want category 5, we want these things. So the specifications, some people might not know. These organizations might not have technical people. They just will know how to use Word, or they may know how to use some other tool. And so we really had to help them with some of the questions. But then they were very eager to build a network. Here's someone with the PVC piping, because part of the cable had to go outside. We had to drill holes everywhere, typical things that maybe a lot of you know how to do. But these people, or this organization, didn't. And so we showed them, and none of these pictures will you see the foreigners doing it. It was the locals doing it, and that's a very important thing and part of it. And working together, it was a long day, but even at the end of the day, they were smiling, still are smiling. And here you see one of the gentlemen, crimping the cable, checking to make sure. And at the end of the day, I don't have a picture of the server. We asked them to go ahead and try to install Red Hat. And here the error is the partition is inconsistent. But they got it to this point, which was pretty good. But to get to this point took 3 days, because it was 2 stories, and there were only 3 people, and we couldn't get all the supplies at once. So it takes time. And then what was the problem is then we had to find the server, the remote server, where they could do their backup. And then we found out that we couldn't get a fixed IP because Guatemala doesn't have an allocation of fixed IPs. And so then we had to do a tunnel first, then so you could reach the machine through another machine in the United States, because there's just not enough static IPs. And if you wanted to get a static IP, it's an extra $500 a month, or it was at the time 2 years ago. And so that was one of the problems. Over the course of the 2 years that they now have a backup solution, the backup server is now full. And of course, because it was a remote site, the server was full. You don't want to, where do you put the server? Do you put it in someone's home? Do you put it in some organization? So it was with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a known international organization. They have a human rights program, or did at the time. But the 500 gigabyte drive filled in 2 years. And so one of the expert technicians in the US took a look inside the drive, and why is this filled? And of course he found a lot of porn and a lot of MP3s. And so then the question is, well, we didn't tell the people at the beginning that they couldn't collect pictures, and it was backing up everything that they were installing on their computer. So someone had peer-to-peer programs, and it was just doing a remote backup. And so in retrospect, then you have to think about that too. If you're putting a backup procedure in place and you're doing a remote backup, what can you put in so you don't make a backup of people's porn? And then the problem was that it needed to be restored. Luckily there were people, but that's the other thing, is to do a backup is maybe simple, but how do you run it in reverse? What is it that needs to be installed on a Linux server so the person just knows what to do? So having written instructions is very important. And so one thing, I guess, mixing with the technology is that you saw there was cabling, you saw there were computers. One has to remember that, as I mentioned earlier, that these type of organizations, their primary job isn't IT, isn't computers, isn't security. It's just working with human rights, and you'll see a picture of what that means. They collect some very important information, as I said, witness testimonies. They'll collect information about witnesses where they're being safely protected, but also information about people who have died. Also forensic information, and they have to collect it. They have to keep not only the computer-generated information, but also the original source information as well too. So when one talks about backing up data or protecting data, it's not just bits. It's not just ones and zeros. It's physical things too. So if one wants to help them, this is one organization in Guatemala that is a forensic anthropology. And so what they do is they go to the countryside when people from the countryside say, we found some bones. And they will go, they will dig up the bones, bring them for analysis to see, well, who are these people? And this is something in Guatemala, that there was a lot of massacres and people were buried in mass graves. And so then these bones get taken back, they get analyzed to see what was the cause of death. And so they have a file on each individual, particular characteristics. And when they find a skull, the skull might have a bullet hole. There might be a bullet. And then so you have to accumulate all that information and protect it, because together with the physical evidence that you might store is then if you then compile all the different electronic data that you find, you might be able to build a case. And so one of the organizations, what they were doing is they did, I think it was over 400 or 500 exhumations, and they added this to their a court case that they launched to bring people to trial. And they can say, well, we know that this general was involved, he was in this area, and people died. And we know who the people were, and we've done all the things. So this is what we're talking, when we talk about human rights organizations in different countries, this is the work. So it's a reality check to remember. And again, this is Guatemala. And the one thing I want to finish with is, I was just there 2 weeks ago. And I found there was an interesting thing that was told to me, is that over the course of the last 5 years, 10 years, and since '96, when there was the peace accords, there's been the population and a lot of the organizations and the human rights organizations that really want to find out what happened during the years of the military dictatorship. And the first thing people asked is, well, we know the police were involved. Can we have access to the police records? And the government, they don't exist. The records don't exist at all. And, you know, for 10 years, they would try to look, nothing would be found. And then just this May, at one of the military barracks, there was an explosion. And one of the government investigators with the Human Rights Office said, let's go visit all the different places where they have military explosives, you know, to see what other things they might be hiding or not. And so they went to the first place where there was the explosion. They didn't find anything, but they said, oh, there's this other military dump in Guatemala City. You might want to go there. So they did, and they found some interesting things, and I'll take you through some of the pictures. So the place that they found was in a residential part of Guatemala. This is what kind of it looks like. Just outside the place that they went, there's a lot of police walking around, but it's a military compound, so it's fine. And as you see, and I'll translate this from the Spanish, it says, it's the service for the disactivation of explosives. So it was a munitions dump. And this is where they bring bombs and mines and other things to deactivate them. And outside you find, because it's a police thing, old police cars. Cars that have been impounded, you know, old vehicles. You look at the outside of the facility, and what does it look like? It looks like this. Not really in really good shape. And the woman that was giving us the tour is there. And so what happens is these government officials went to this place. They walked down these stairs, and where you see all the trash, they found stuff like this. Documents. And I'll show you a few pictures in a moment, but they started seeing that these are photocopies of national ID cards, documents that were either bound up, or a lot of documents that were just piled everywhere. And what they had found is they had found the archive that they had been searching for the last 10 years. And when they went through, they basically found out that almost all of the police archives from 1904 and to the present were being stored here. And the first thing that they said is, we need to protect this. And so they got a judicial order to make sure that the police wouldn't want to destroy it. The second thing is they took a look, and they invited some international experts. There's an organization in the US called the National Security Archive, known as the NSA, but they're the good NSA. And they're involved in declassifying government documents. And so they work with a lot of they declassify US government documents, but also with archives around the world. And so they immediately called the people from the good NSA in the US to say, look what we found, can you come and pay us a visit? So if you go to I can show you the photos from the NSA. And they basically found, again, documents from 1904 to the present. When they asked the women who were working there's about 8 of them at the time, and still am and have always worked there, as they said, how are these things organized? We want to find out what happened during this time period. They said they were all organized according to year, what part of the country, and what police station it came from. That's how it's organized. And so you have a very big facility, that's how it's organized. And in terms of the pictures, you have one place you had 8-inch discs. I hadn't seen them in years, so that was really interesting. No computers to read them, by the way, but you could see the 8-inch discs. Piles and piles of documents everywhere. The problem was with the documents is that, some of them are nicely organized. Others are not. And as you can see